The question of the day: what are you doing here? That is a question that God asked Elijah not once, but twice. In case you're not familiar with him, Elijah lived in the northern kingdom of Israel about 900 years before Christ was born. His name means, "My God is Yahweh." During the reign of Ahab, Elijah defended the worship of the Hebrew God over and against the worship of the Canaanite deity Baal. While Ahab was king, he built a temple for Baal, and his wife Jezebel brought in a large group of priests and prophets to run it. The more the merrier, right? The move secured a peaceful relationship with the Phoenicians. And if one god was good, then having two gods would be better, right? The problem was that their laws, handed down from God through Moses, declared, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. For I am the Lord your God. I am a jealous God." Elijah, as his name implied, would not accept the worship of Baal. And Ahab was caught then in between a rock and a hard place. If he gave in to Elijah, then his wife would surely make his life miserable. And thus the conflict began. Elijah confronted the king and told him that God had spoken and that there would be a devastating drought across the land. Why a drought? Because supposedly Baal was a Canaanite god responsible for rain, thunder, lightning, and dew. The drought would prove beyond all doubt that their God was powerless. During the 3 years that followed, Elijah fled the country, befriended and saved the life of a widow who was kind to him. Later, he restored life to her dead child as well, which was the first instance of resurrection recorded in the Bible. And then 3 years later, Elijah returned to Israel to confront Ahab once again. Ahab called him the troubler of Israel, which he was, but in a good way. Elijah had Ahab gather together the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah to take part in a showdown. And to make a long story short, fire fell from the sky, and the false prophets of Baal were killed. Then and only then did God end the drought, and the rains finally return. All hell breaks loose then, and Jezebel threatens his life. Elijah is forced to flee once more, this time to Mount Horeb. That is when God asked him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The question implied that Elijah was not where he needed to be. He was in hiding instead. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty," he said. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." So he replied. God told him, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord." What happened then were 3 manifestations of the presence of God: a mighty wind, an earthquake, and a fire. And lest we get the wrong idea, none of these was God. They were simply proof of the power of God. And then God asked Elijah again, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah just repeated what he'd said before. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, put your prophets to death with a sword. I am the only one left. Now they are trying to kill me too." In a way, I think Elijah was trying to retire. In essence, he was saying, "Look, God, I am retired now. It's time for you to find someone else." Funny thing, I've met a lot of retired pastors, and I always find out that they are just as busy now as they were before, doing some sort of good work, if not always preaching. Age slows them down and forces a compromise of sorts, but the Lord still makes good use of them. More pastors fail retirement than those in any other profession, with the possible exception of being a housewife and a mother, because we know that job never ends. Retirement was definitely not something God had in mind for Elijah. The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also appoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel Mahala, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." Elijah thought that the war was lost, but God reminded him that it was just one battle that he had lost, not the whole war. Often we are in the same place. We struggle for what we believe is right, and we fail to make any progress. Then we look around and we think that all is lost. But God sees a much greater plan than the one we have, and God intends far more for our life than we have imagined. There is an oft-quoted verse from the book of Jeremiah, words spoken to a defeated nation in exile. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." We sell God short sometimes because we think that it is all over. We give up. We go into hiding, thinking that we have failed in life and that the world is spinning out of control now, and there is no point in trying to do anything to make it right. Why do you think God sent the wind and the earthquake and the fire upon the mountaintop? I believe it was to remind Elijah that he had a powerful God on his side. So why then was Elijah feeling as if everything was lost? The battle was still raging. Why was he not there where he should be in the midst of it? I guess even prophets get tired of fighting sometimes, but God doesn't. St. Augustine was the one who once said, "Pray as though everything depended on God. Work as though everything depended on you." What God intends, God will do at just the right time, in just the right place. And the victory that God intends will ultimately be won by God. We do have a role to play in that. If we truly want the world to change, then we must be present in the world. If we want what is right to prevail, we must boldly declare what is right. If there is some pathway we can walk, then we must be ready to do so in the Lord's name. And above all else, yes, we should be praying without ceasing. The real message here is not that we should take on the world and all its problems. That, in fact, is really God's task. But we must remain ready to be God's people, doing what is right for however long is necessary with all the strength we have to do so. God will win the battle if we let God do so. And if not through us, then it will be through others within the world. And if not in the world, then it will at least be in us. We have it on record. God told Elijah, "I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." So I reckon at any given time there must be at least 7,000 other people in the world who are still righteous, even when we think that we might be the last one. It's actually probably a lot more than that by now, and to be sure, sometimes we're not even in that number, but we should definitely try to be. Interestingly, Elijah doesn't do exactly what God told him to do. He just does the last part. He finds Elisha, who takes up the task, and eventually it is Elisha, his successor, who accomplishes all the rest. Some scholars see in this the way that God made up for Elijah's failure to be in the fight to the end. They see a troubling and tragic picture of the once great Elijah, fearful, curved in on himself, faithless, and ultimately disobedient to his call. That is harsh. And I admit it is tempting to do that, but I do not see him that way at all. If I did, then why would I still belong to the church, which all too often seems like it too is fearful, curved in on itself, faithless, and ultimately disobedient to God's call? Instead, I see Elijah as battle-worn and doing the best that he can. And I remain in the church because I believe it is doing the best that it can. And I know that God's plan is bigger than I am, thankfully, and that God will eventually win the battle. I want to be on the winning side when he does, and so do you. Be safe, and God bless you.